Unity is something that has been preached by our forefathers. When we look back to the 1960s, we had a lot of the Pan-African leaders where we looked at the likes of Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, who preached the unity of the African continent. And fast forward, all African countries are liberated from colonial rule, and African countries are in the hands of the African leadership. Now, in 2026, we are seeing some elements that seem not to be in line with the unity of the African continent that our leaders had preached for. And these are the happenings that are happening in the southern tip of Africa, in a country called South Africa. You have seen the images, you have seen the videos, you have heard it on the news from different parts of the African continent. And today we are focusing on those happenings that are happening in South Africa. But before we go any further, I would like to bring up our panel. We have people joining from Uganda, East Africa. We have people joining from Nigeria, and people joining like myself here in the United States. We have Dr. Dikeleli. Please introduce yourself in a minute or less.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Dikeleli Mokoena. I am a South African who is a loving wife of a wonderful Tanzanian man, and I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you, Dikeleli. And we go to the leader of the Young African Leaders Forum, Mr. Prince. Give us your intro, sir.
Yeah, hello, everybody. My name is Prince Ifoh. I am a Nigerian, but I live in the United States. Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And we go to the heartland itself, South Africa. Enele, introduce yourself, sir.
Thank you, Noah. Good evening, everyone. My name is Anele Mgese. I am based in South Africa, and in the heart of South Africa, I'm currently based in Johannesburg. And I'm very happy to be here to have this dialogue with my African colleagues in the diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you. We go to Eludi in the US.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Heriod Kabamanya. I am from Tanzania, but I live in the US. I'm happy to be here to share in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And we go to another East African country, in Uganda, to a man with a unique name. Kiza, introduce yourself.
Sawubona, habari, and good evening, everyone. My name is Africa Chiza. I am based in Uganda, and it's great to be here.
Let's go to Mary. Mary, introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Mary Njia. I'm from Kenya, and I'm delighted to join you all.
Thank you, Mary.
Yes. Thank you so much for this opportunity to make this very important remark as an opening for this very important conversation. I think we have a very difficult question at this time. And that difficult question will be, what has happened to the African spirit of solidarity? Over the past few weeks, we have seen many disturbing images from the continent, especially in South Africa. Businesses have been destroyed, families are displaced, communities are living in fear, and worse still, we have seen very disturbing videos of Africans being lynched and killed by fellow Africans. But before this is what I think, before we begin to discuss whether we call it xenophobia or we focus on it as Afrophobia, there is an important or a deeper question that we ought to ask. And that would be, what has happened to the spirit that once united Africans across borders? What will Madiba, Nelson Mandela, how will he feel about the South Africa that he fought so hard to liberate? How would he feel about it today? Now, because at some point in time, there was, the period when Africans, stood with one another and, were very, very confident in the solidarity that they had towards one another. But today, I think that spirit has become weaker, and it appears to be very disturbing for all of us. But one thing that I always start with when I talk about some conversations like this, one thing I tell young people is the fact that South Africa, from the very important period, never walked the freedom path alone. When apartheid in South Africa was very disturbing, there were many comrades on the continent who stood alongside the continent, alongside South Africa. Nigerians, for instance, marched and provided strong financial support for the anti-apartheid movement. Tanzanians, we know, under Julius Nyerere, mobilized strong military and political support for the anti-apartheid movement. Zambians also hosted freedom fighters. Mozambicans also did some things and played very important role. And generally, almost all African countries donated whichever way they could to help the African people in South Africa, liberate from the apartheid and strands that was holding them for a very long time. Now, these were very important periods because at the time, the freedom of South Africans mattered generally to everybody. We could see from that period that Pan-Africanism has never been treated as a mere ideology. It is rather a commitment and a belief that our destinies as a people is very important and interconnected. Since 1963, Kwame Nkrumah had called for the unity of Africans. And he said famously, we have to unite or we perish. I think it is important to make a very clear statement here that violence against migrants in South Africa can never be justified. But if we want solution, then it is important that we go back to the foundations and see why these tensions have emerged. What are the things that young South Africans are complaining about? They are complaining about the fact that the foreigners are taking their jobs, but these things are already some of the underlying challenges across many African societies. In many African societies, young people face, unemployment, rising costs, housing challenges, economic insecurity, limited opportunities. And in those conditions, across many African countries, in South Africa, in Nigeria, in many other African countries, these conditions bring about frustrations. And these frustrations, we know, is very telling on the young people of the continent. And what else do? They begin to look for somebody to blame. And so for South Africans, for instance, the foreigners, especially African foreigners, because they did not target every foreigner, they were focused on African foreigners. The African foreigners were the visible target, and then they come with some uncomfortable truth, and then begin to say some things like African migrants are doing this and doing that and all of that. But migrants did not create Africa's economic crisis or economic and unemployment crisis. Migrants did not create inequality. Migrants did not create the decades of economic exclusion, especially in South Africa. Migrants did not create the domination of the whites over the black in South Africa. Migrants did not create, all the, the inequalities that we continue to see exist in South Africa, despite the victory during the apartheid movement. And then if we mistake these symptoms for causes, then I think it's important for us to know that we will never solve that problem. Before I round up, I wanted to talk about something very important, and that is how Africa is planning its future. What are we looking at as a continent? How are we looking towards the future? What is the kind of Africa that we are building? We are building an Africa where borders would not become walls, but instead borders would become bridges. It is very annoying to see that during the current World Cup, the first match and the second match against South Africans, many Africans, were rather supporting Mexico and supporting Czechia over its own South Africa. But this is not the kind of Africa we wanted to create. And this is not the kind of Africa our founding fathers, thought about and, imagined at some point. We are looking at the future of Africa that will talk about the Agenda 2063, which is a vision to unite us and bring us together in a shared prosperity by 2063. We are looking at a future of Africa, that talks about continental trade, youth innovation, youth mobility, and even regional integration across borders. And this would depend on trust. An African in South Africa must be able to trust an African in Zambia or an African in Mali or in Nigeria. An African and this is why the organization we operate, Young African Leaders Forum, plays a very important role. It's a way of bringing young people together to understand that despite whatever difference we have, the most important thing we have is our shared unity. So no continent can become integrated if its people fear one another. Now, unity in this sense is not a slogan. Like we have been talking about unity for a very long time, but instead unity is infrastructure. Unity must be a policy on the continent. Unity is our culture, and it must continue to be our way of thinking. So what do I say as I round up this? What do I say that we must continue to do on the continent in order to ensure that this current occurrence in South Africa does not spread to the other parts of the continent, and in fact dies entirely on the continent, even reappearing in South Africa, because it's happened over and over and over again? I think the South African government for a very long time have failed to teach African history better and in a very more in an effective way that that they ought to have taught it. And so I think it is important to teach African history better. This would be my first recommendation, that we must teach African history better. Young people ought to know that Africa is for Africa, and what Africans did for one another during liberation struggles remains the seal of our togetherness and of our unity as a people. Secondly, I think it is important for us to create opportunities on the continent so that economic despair will not make us enemies of one another. Because in this sense, already when we see what South Africans are saying, they are taking our jobs, and that is the most important thing. So economic despair is one of the greatest enemies of social cohesion. And so we want to make sure that we create opportunities so that economic despair does not become, the very important fulcrum that drives the hatred and the enmity of Africans against Africans. If we look at other continents, for instance, I'll use Europe, for instance. All you need in Europe is one visa, and you are able to access most of the countries in Europe. This is the kind of Africa we think about, where it is the borders are not walls but are bridges, and every African can go everywhere without having to worry about anything. But then we must hold our government responsible, and then we must hold our government accountable, and we must make sure that we have very strong economies across border. Then thirdly, I think it's important for us to rebuild Pan-African relationships. Now, this is not just between government, but it must happen between young people. It must happen between students. And this is why I said Young African Leaders Forum exists. For instance, we have comrades like Anele and some other people in different parts of the continent and all of that. And we know for sure that these brothers and these sisters and these comrades of ours, share that strong solidarity. And in matters like this, they would not, betray the African spirit, but would rather stand with us despite, the opposition. And so not between government alone, but between even students, even entrepreneurs, researchers, artists, and everybody. And finally, I think it is important we recover that simple idea that we are not strangers to one another. It is true we might be different nations, but we are not strangers. And I think this must be the most important Pan-African lesson that we must continue to preach during this period. We might be South Africans and Nigerians and Ghanaians and all of that, but we are not strangers to each other. We must never see ourselves as strangers to each other. So when future generations begin to look, on this moment, it is important that they know that there is no need to turn against another person that is from an African, origin, just like you. And so we must remember that, we have a vision for, a shared continent where solidarity is stronger than fear, where dignity is stronger than division, and where, being African is something that is worth more than just mere geography and borders. And so this is my little contribution today, and I think it is important for us to remember that we must continue to look at this in the right direction so that Africa can move as it ought to be, and we get to realize the dreams of our founding fathers and achieve the Agenda 2063. Thank you.
I'm happy that the leadership of Nelson Mandela and others, when they came out, they saw it fit to pay tribute and visit Kenneth Kaunda. And I know South Africans, there are two people that they admire the most: Kenneth Kaunda and Kalusha Walia. So we'll leave it at that. So those who follow soccer, they know who the great Kalu is. That is somebody that South Africans remember, and Kenneth Kaunda. And then the other person that they will remember now, it's me, because I was in Joburg and I'm wearing Nelson Mandela. I bought this actually in Soweto Township. I was there checking out some of my people who still live there.
All right. Okay. I think as an academic, I'm going to take this opportunity to set the tone in terms of providing conceptual clarity, right? So that when we discuss what is happening in South Africa, we actually are in the same frame in terms of really what is going on, as well as the words rather that we use to describe this. And I think this is triggered by the word lynching that was used by my colleague earlier, and I was like, that's intense, right? To say that people were lynched. So in terms of facts, facts that have been shared by the South African police services, about 3 people so far have been killed during these protests. And I think that's important that we clarify that. And then also the other thing that needs to be clarified is also what actually, I guess the words, and I'm saying this again as an academic who then is trying to study and understand what exactly is going on in South Africa. And what is coming up is essentially a focus on illegal immigration, right? And not migrants in particular or in general. I think it's important for us to understand that part. And in a sense that conceptually an illegal immigrant, which is a terrible word to even use, for us in the continent, because no African is ever illegal. Imagine what a preposterous concept. So this, and I think you have international scholars also in agreement with this. So the use is undocumented or irregular migrants, and I just want to sort of differentiate the different types of undocumented or irregular migration or migrants that have been highlighted in these particular conversations. So you have undocumented migrants who essentially are individuals who may have entered a country legally with a passport, but stayed past their visa expiration or lost legal status, right? Number one. So you have asylum seekers, essentially would be people who are crossing the border without any documentation, could be without a passport. And the reason for that could be because they're fleeing from a war, persecution, or any form of violence. But then now what, in terms of the 1951 Refugee Convention, whatever happens in that context, then that particular individual has to present themselves to the authorities, right? And then you have another category, which is undocumented economic migrants or irregular labor migrants, right? Again, in this case, you may have people who then cross the border with a passport and then on a tourist visa, and then they end up, working or opening a salon or whatever. In some instances, people actually do cross in without any form of documentation, right? And they're irregular. And in certain instances, they end up then also working in the South African or any context in that matter. So I think it's important for us to be able to differentiate what the concepts that we're dealing with here, and in this conversation, particularly to sort of highlight that particular, from what I've seen and what I've been researching, what these protests are about illegal or undocumented immigrants. So now that brings us up to a broader conversation about why, after so many years, our African leaders have been saying it's important. I mean, our ancestors actually said we must unite. We need to actually become one. We're talking about integration, economic integration. We're talking about free movement of people, etc., etc. And in a sense, now we then actually believe that certain people are illegal, right? Unfortunately, within the context in which, the Bismarckian context in which many African states still operate in, as nation states who consider themselves as sovereign, and for whatever reasons, our leaders are refusing to get rid of our borders. So you are seeing that in that particular context, there's a great sense of people coming in or moving all over the continent on the basis of various governance issues, right? And we are also then seeing this in South Africa as well. Governance issues, huge governance issues that are also, in a sense, if we are talking about that particular conversation about governance issue, again, as a Pan-Africanist who's anti-borders, who's pro-unification, it brings up this, again, a conversation around governing Bismarckian borders that we should actually be getting rid of. All right. So I don't know if I should keep it at that for now, and then later on we can continue the conversation so that I don't speak for too long. But then we can, yeah. So I think what was important is just for us in terms of setting the tone, in terms of language and the conversation, particularly the concepts that we use.
Yes, take it away. Your in 2 minutes or so, your introduction or your perspective on what is happening currently in South Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I will use 2 minutes. I don't know if I will manage, but I will force myself to manage. But what we see in Africa, in South Africa, and in Africa, basically, is a question of the economic system. So this, in most cases, people do not talk about the economic structures that actually govern our countries, and especially in neoliberal situation. I was looking at South Africa, even the point that those who are protesting against the so-called migrant in South Africa, the point they are raising, you see, it reflects the economic structure that most of the Africans in their countries, they don't own their economy. In that sense, they cannot access the so-called employment or the places to access opportunities and all that. So, but the other thing we see, and we don't talk about it, the group that is actually protesting, if you look at that group, you see it is not working people's group. This is a political group, because I was looking whether this kind of movement is from the street vendors, the workers in street, the workers in industries, the workers in factories, the workers in farms. This group emerged from a certain kind of organization within the city, which is actually out of the working people. So that's one. The second thing is the question of Africans being immigrant within Africans. This actually is another antithesis. You see, these guys, if we struggle to get independence, the second struggle was to dismantle the boundaries. Now, if we use the boundaries to justify the exploitation, to justify the other people, then we are reverting back to colonial system. So what we see in South Africa is now, instead of using Kara as a justification of segregation, now it's the boundaries as a justification for segregation, because the boundaries we have they are not the boundaries the Africans created. There was no time Africa transformed to have those boundaries. These are Berlin boundaries. So if you are using it, say, okay, this person is a foreigner, must go back. This person is a foreigner, must not have job here. Then what you are saying is the Maasai in Kenya and Maasai in Tanzania stop being a Maasai because of the border in between. That's what you are saying. So you see, we are reverting back to colonial kind of structures instead of dismantling them. And that's where I'm going to the point Prince was making, that we needed to teach much more on African history and African structure and what the liberation mean and what the movement means. So we see those kind of stuff. Maybe I should stop here because I have many things. Yes, I will stop here. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you for that. Yeah. So I know a lot of people are fired up to go, but I appreciate you being mindful of the time so that at least we can get everybody else onto the program to share their thoughts. Again, this is us as African people sitting down, looking at the challenges that we are having. How can we address them collectively, amicably, so that we maintain what our founding fathers were preaching, unity for all Africans? Now, let's go back to a gentleman with a unique name, and he's going to tell us why his name is unique. And let's get his thoughts on this conversation.
Thank you so much, Noah. I was born 9 months after the release of Madiba, and my father, who was in Zambia by that time as a trade unionist, named me South Africa. He was celebrating the release of Nelson Mandela and what it meant for the new South Africa. But of course, the church could not allow, and the name South was removed, so I stayed Africa. But that is meant to show you the selflessness of the struggle of South Africa and how it was owned by the different actors, especially the non-South Africans. Now, when I see what is happening in South Africa, I feel the protesters are being penny wise and pound foolish. And I'm using my words carefully here, moderator. Penny wise, in that, yes, it is easy to blame a Tanzanian, a Nigerian, when Nigeria sacrificed close to $40 million to support the cause. It is easy to blame a Zimbabwean, like you had put it, Noah, when these countries are actually at the front line and being bombed and targeted. It's easy to attack them and say, hey, you are the ones that are taking my job. That is being penwise. Being pound foolish is when you actually fail to examine the fact that and understand the fact that what is causing unemployment, what is causing these all challenges is the economic misgovernance in Africa, not necessarily by the South African government, but by the global empire, by the global capital. Because as South Africa, and like any other countries in Africa, the economy of South Africa is in the hands of global capital and a few multinational corporations, many who are rent-seeking, many who are actually owning the mining rights, and who are actually repatriating much of these profits. So the issue here is that we ought to examine the issue of South Africa from the global perspective, from the global empire and capital perspective. And once we do that, then we shall realize that actually it is not a Nigerian, it is not an Ethiopian, it is not a Tanzanian who is the problem in South Africa. It is global capital, it is imperialism, it is the multinational corporations which keep milking Africa and are creating these economic misgovernance issues, which we need to really address. I thank you.
Yes, I think that's well said, sir, because it's always easier for us to point the finger at each other and say, no, it's you who are causing that. Like when you look at the clock, you see the hands moving, There is a lot of gears in the back of the clock that makes those things happen. And it's easy for us to point fingers at each other. This is contrary to what our founding fathers stood for when they were promoting the free South Africa. Ibrahim, your take on the happenings?
I see. Thank you for having me. It's simply just an unfortunate situation that can actually happen in any African country. But basically, if we are to understand what is actually going on in South Africa, we have to look at the historical precedents, we have to look at the economic. I noticed someone just mentioned that now. But basically, what we need to know is that this xenophobia does not just arise today. It is just a combination of a lot of things. As I said earlier, we need to actually look at the historical origin of it and what are the economic incentives that actually encourage such. Without me wasting most of the time, maybe I should just raise one or two things. Basically, you know, South Africa is well developed. Yeah, at least I think in among all the African countries is so well developed. But the basic problem is that that development, the result, or what would I call the economy, the outcome of it, most of people that actually benefit from it are very minimal. And by so doing, majority of the people are just seeing those words all over there, but they do not benefit from it. And then when such a thing happens, then automatically, as part of survival instincts, people tend to find an excuse or find explanation for whatsoever thing that is happening around them. And one of the things they can actually do is to look at the other side and say, maybe my problem is coming from this person. Maybe my problem is coming from that. But basically, what is actually happening in South Africa is not something that just starts today. I can tell you, it can happen in any African country. But the basic thing is this. The basic thing is that the institutions that are supposed to be in place are the ones that are lacking. Those institutions are not there. And that is why we are having that today. And that's why you have all these political entrepreneurs coming in, trying to use that opportunity in order to get supporters and then in order to win more votes. So from my own side, it's just an unfortunate thing. And I believe with time and in this program, and it is something we'll be able to fashion out what are the ways, what are the things that we can do in order that Pan-Africanism can actually continue living and doing well in Africa. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well said. Give us your thoughts on, make sure you are unmuted. Give us your thoughts on the happenings right now.
Well, sadly, we've had this xenophobic thing in South Africa for the longest time possible. And it's very unfortunate. We are still talking about the same thing that our forefathers talked about many years ago. And the future they had for Africa is completely different to what we are giving them now. And if they would wake up today and find the way the whole Africa, not just South Africa, is so messed up, I think they would rather just go back to where they came from. Xenophobic in South Africa, maybe it's one of the countries that is known for that. But if you go deeply and start looking at countries without taking sides, it's everywhere, actually. For example, in Kenya, you hear people say, even for the casual jobs, they say Ugandans are coming to Kenya to take their jobs. The Rwandese are coming to Kenya to take their jobs. And if you see the jobs these people are talking about are Shamba boys, house helps, and the main issue here is the payment, because you find the foreigners are coming to your country. Yes, they're coming to work. Their work is very diligent, and the only difference comes in when the payment time reaches, because most people find foreigners demanding for less payment. So I think that is one of the issues that is going on in South Africa. But I don't think it's an issue to blame our African brothers and sisters. The issues that we face, like unemployment, poverty, these are things that are happening everywhere. So if I start blaming my financial situation because of a random South African or a random Rwandese or a random South Sudanese, it's not fair, because we find that some of these foreigners, they come because maybe in their countries there is no peace. For example, you have the Congolese as refugees in many countries in Africa. So someone like that, you're going to be chasing them away, and they thought that this is the place they would find peace. You know, uh, there are children also in this thing, and there was a clip actually just a few seconds ago I was watching of one of the founders. I don't know whether he's a founder or anything, the head of this xenophobic movement in South Africa. So he just meets someone on the street and he's like, "Where is your country?" The man is like, "From Congo. What are you doing here? We gave you like a chance to like leave our country." So I'm wondering, I thought this thing was about illegal movement to South Africa and stuff. But currently, as things are going, it's no longer about illegal immigration. It's something personal that people have, but their frustrations, they're taking them to other countries and they're not like ready to like address their issues within themselves. So if we start chasing our own African brothers and sisters and we leave the Asians, the Europeans, like what is the spirit of Pan-Africanism that you're building here? The likes of Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, who unfortunately comes from South Africa, they believed on a future Africa where there would be unity everywhere, where people would work. Maybe I go to Uganda, I work there, like just unity, not a place where you'd feel like you're going to your neighbor, but then you're not welcomed. So I think it's a very unfortunate thing that is happening, and maybe just to conclude on this, as a young person or a human rights advocate, I believe that all of us like deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of where we are coming from, regardless of the job that we are all doing. If I go somewhere and even if my payment is less than yours, just respect that, so long as you are doing something that is okay. And we also can acknowledge people's frustrations without justifying discrimination over violence against others. Killing someone, beating someone up will not change the fact that you don't have jobs in your country. Because some of these people, they force their frustrations at others, yet they don't have real skills for these jobs that they are mentioning. Because this same guy, I heard him mention the GPA of South Africa and stuff, and he actually has no idea what GPA is. He's about, he said each South African should be given money. So you see, their agenda changes from jobs to wanting money. You know, it's it's just confusion somewhere. So yeah, that's my take on this. Thank you so much. Over to you.
All right. So thank you, Mary, for that. Hear from a person who is on the ground in South Africa, because I couldn't get any of my South African people here in the US to come because they felt unfortunate with what is happening. But we are very privileged and excited and happy to have a gentleman who is on the ground in South Africa. A lot has been said, and Nele, what's your take on what is happening?
Thank you. Thank you, my brother. Thank you, Noah. And thank you to the colleagues for their inputs on what's currently happening in South Africa. What I can say is that, first of all, we need to, I like what Dr. Dikeleli Mokoena said. We need to be careful of the terms that we're using in discussing this topic. What the people that are advancing or advocating for the deportation of undocumented migrants, all right? They're saying that we want undocumented migrants to leave the country. Now, my take is this. One, we first need to, it's important for me in this discussion here to first make sure that we are on the same page in terms of what xenophobia means. Xenophobia is not the same thing as Afrophobia. Xenophobia means that you have a fear or prejudice or hatred of people from other countries, not specifically African countries. Yes, the videos we've seen, in most circumstances, particularly in Durban, it's where you have people that are confronting undocumented Malawians that are in South Africa, right? there is a part of that. But what this, in my view, number one, this is nothing new. This is not new. Xenophobic attacks have happened since 1994 in South Africa. We had one in 1994, 1998, 2008, 2015, 2021, up until 2026. This has been happening for quite some time. And it's not something that only happens in South Africa. It happens all around the world and in Africa. It has happened between Ghana and Nigeria. It has happened now, my colleague was mentioning, between Rwanda and DRC. These things do happen around the world, right? And what we need to understand as Africans, number one, is that South Africa on its own, we need to understand the dynamics, the economic variables that are currently happening in South Africa. My view is that this is a misguided anger. If you look at the demographics of South Africa, people that are not from South Africa, so in general, foreigners, they make up about, this is according to Stats SA, they make up about 3.7% of the population. You're talking about 2.4 to 3 million, right? Now, if you were to take all of them, including documented and undocumented, you take them out, you're still sitting with an unemployment that is above 30%. You're still sitting with an unemployment that is above, that's about 45% for the youth in South Africa. They will still find another angle to voice out their anger. That's number one. Then number two, South Africa is the only country in Africa where the capital is not in the hands of Africans. We must keep these two things in our minds whenever we're having such discussions. South Africa is the only country where the capital, it is the largest country in Africa by gross domestic product, but it's the only one where the capital is not in the Africans. Now, that invites a lot of things. It invites a lot of things. If you were to just go on YouTube or Google or wherever, just listen to the former statistician general, Dr. Ifoh, and just listen to what has happened to South Africa since 1994. This economy should have been much bigger than it is right now, but it's because it's in the hands of the few. That is why it's not where it's supposed to be. And I do believe that a lot of this, number three, a lot of this is on governance, and that's where we need to work. In Africa, and particularly around the world, we have a vacuum of leadership, and we've experienced this. The European Union has the word union in it, but it's not united. African Union is a word union in it, but it's not united. And these are things that we need to work on, particularly in South Africa, because xenophobic attacks are not new this year. They've happened since 1994, but our government still does not have a solution or a credible solution that they need to actually roll out to the general public, together with our SADC leaders and our African leaders. I'll just leave it at that, and then I'll expand on the governance issues in my speech. Thank you.
Well said, well said. It's important. I like the point that you made is, yes, South Africa is a unique country in the sense that the economy, the powers that be, the power of business investment is in the hands of the few. 80% of South Africa, and even the land, is not in South African by Black people like us. It's in 100%. The other people, and they control. So when we are having conversation about these matters, we have to understand, I think this applies even for other African countries. You have the African Union, a sort of like a symbol or organization that is toothless, because the African Union depends also on donation of donor aid for it to function. So when you are being funded by other people, you are going to be construed as to what you can do or what you can say, because you're going to be controlled. So we're going to take a first break and we'll be right back. Yes, Dr. Dikeleli, you've been sitting there relaxing, waiting for your turn. So I know a lot has been shared, a lot has been said. So here is the context now. These questions will be looking at the historical foundations for Pan-Africanism, you being an academician. So the question for you is, Pan-Africanism emerged as a response to colonialism, slavery, and racial oppression. What are the core principles of Pan-Africanism that remain relevant to today's Africa?
All right. Well, thank you very much. Such a wonderful question. I think one of the challenges that we have when it comes to Pan-Africanism is the different permutations or different orientations of what, or different understandings of what Pan-Africanism is, right? And I think that's why we have resulted, or what we see with the African Union today. I think basically, different ideas of what Pan-Africanism is in action has also resulted in, again, the way in which the continent, including the pace in which we are actually integrating or working towards integration, right? And the other thing as well, which one of the panelists mentioned earlier, which was wonderful, I think it's important that we highlight this as well, has been the ideological, right? So the ideological orientation, which Pan-Africanism, particularly the dominant form of Pan-Africanism that seems to be practiced today, right? Which then takes on this neoliberal approach towards Pan-Africanism. All right. So a lot of the times when we are speaking about, continental free trade agreement, and so we want actually one Africa, but which is wonderful. But now what we need to be mindful of is the neoliberal context in which that happens. And then if we are then talking about that, and then to what extent now are we then positioning workers within the continent, right? And I think this particular conversation about xenophobia, of what is happening in South Africa, actually brings in the labor aspect. And I'm going to invite everyone to try and think about this differently, right? So you have South Africans who are saying, we don't, actually, if you are undocumented, please leave the country, and then you can come back. When you come back legally, right? Number one. So that, of course, is a reflection of governance, right? And again, in all of this, basically, people are talking about governance of the border. There's also governance of an institution within South Africa that deals with migration, which is Home Affairs, right? And there have been also issues around corruption that have been linked to basically, Home Affairs, its issuance of identity documents, of passports, of permits, of visas, etc. And the Special Investigations Unit this year has been arresting people actually working within Home Affairs who are involved in selling fraudulent documents in the country in terms of citizenship, permits, a number of other things. So in all of this, right? So what are the protesters are saying? And I'm basing this on one of the videos that I watched on YouTube, which was an interview of Jacinta. I think she was being interviewed. I can't remember by which news network. She says in this thing, she says, look, interestingly, she says, actually, it is the non-South Africans who are xenophobic against South Africans. And I was like, okay, what do you mean? Then she goes on to say, look, when you are in a country and then you accept a wage that is below minimum wage, right? What you're doing is that you are actually enabling a situation whereby the super exploitation, the capitalist super exploitative, of course, you should not use this language the way that I'm using it, right? But you allowing the super exploitative neoliberal capitalist economy to continue to thrive. Because when the South African says, I cannot work for that amount of money because it does not allow living, it does not allow decent living, it does not allow well-being, so then you come in as, for example, a Malawi, and then you're actually going to take that particular whatever salary. And I think, in as much as I heard my sister mentioning this, that it's okay. I don't think it is okay that we should justify super exploitation of migrant labor, or any form of labor for that matter. Because now what this does is, yes, we are talking about unification, economic growth of the continent of various African countries, but it should not be at the expense of human beings and the labor of Africans. And I think this is where the opportunity for all Africans, all African workers to come in and say, look, we actually need to be uniting against exploitative wages within the continent. It doesn't matter whether I am in Kenya, or it doesn't matter whether I am in South Africa, it doesn't matter whether I'm in Nigeria or wherever I am. We need to collectively organize ourselves. So even if I migrate from one place to the next, we should all say we demand wages that enable livelihood. We demand wages that enhance dignity. We demand wages that actually are within what we consider, for example, I mean, different countries have different minimum wages, right? So that is what all workers should be uniting. And in this case, what the South African anti-undocumented immigrant protesters are saying is, you are actually getting in the way of us fighting white capital in South Africa that actually exploits. And this particular, and by the way, this is not new to South African white capital, by the way, right? It has always done this. So historically, when we go back decades ago, like literally even almost a century ago, so you find certain people arrive on on the continent, and they're like, oh, so you have this mine, so now we're going to actually start mining this, right? But now, and then we also have these farms that we're going to take over, and now we also require labor. And then the locals are like, no, why would I be working for slave wages? I mean, I've been owning this land. I can engage in subsistence farming, for example, and therefore I'm not going to work on this land on what you are. So, and then what then happened is you had South African, so that the South African state at the time importing labor, right? The same thing happened in the mining sector as well, right? So where we have, again, a super exploitation. I don't know, some of you who are aware of the South African political economy of migration, including some of the terrible conditions in which Black miners actually operated in the mining sector in South Africa. So these are some of the issues that are happening there. And the other thing is, in this conversation, what we also need to highlight, when somebody is undocumented in South Africa, they are the most vulnerable. What that means is, one, the fact that, of course, nobody knows that you are in the country, nobody knows where you're working, but also you don't even have bargaining rights against any form of exploitation. You are no longer, for some, you lose out on the entitlements that the labor laws in South Africa actually grant its workers, right? So your right to, for example, paid leave, your right to what is this? I guess collective bargaining, you're right, so many other things, including, of course, minimum wages, right? So all of these things are happening in the context whereby your South African capital is taking advantage of the vulnerability of various people and actually also pitting us against one another, as opposed to workers actually collectively coming together. The same thing that, of course, these migrant, sort of undocumented migrant protesters are doing, instead of saying, look, we understand that all of us are affected. And it's not they do not understand. I mean, they are saying that, go back and fix your country. The reason why you're here is because certain things. So it's not like they don't understand. They do understand. But what should be happening is, how do we collectively come together as workers? How do we collectively come together as Africans who are suffering, whether you are in South Africa, whether you're in Uganda, whether you are in Tanzania, wherever you are? But we need to be coming together and say, we are tired of the living conditions in which we find ourselves in. We are tired of our work and the worth of our labor, the worth of our, the hands of, the labor of our hands being devalued the way it is. And then from there on, then we begin to have a conversation, which one of the panelists wonderfully brought into a discussion, a conversation about global economic governance, including coloniality that continues to shape economic governance, political and economic governance, or the political economy of governance in the continent, right? Whereby a lot of our countries continue to be where they are, partly because of the governance choices that are being made, partly because of corruption, partly because we continue to serve foreign interests. And by foreign interests, I mean, like, you know, actors outside of the continent. So all of these things are at play in the conversation. So all of this is taking away, despite, yes, and not despite, it's wonderful that, you know, that's why I'm not repeating what other colleagues are saying, that this is about governance, this is about another. But what this moment should be doing for all of us is, how do we confront the source of the issue that actually is leading us to where we are? Right. And I think also it's important to be mindful that also we don't even fall into the trap that enables a failure of conversation or a dialogue. And I say failure in a sense that coming into a conversation already with preconceived understanding of what is happening, as opposed to asking and understanding what exactly is happening. Do you get what I'm saying? So I think in that sense, we really need to deal with this crisis, certainly, but shift the direction and the conversation towards the fact that all of us are oppressed under a similar global economic governance model that is creating havoc for everyone in the world, not just Africans, but everyone, all the people all over the world. And of course, because we are located within the peripheries in Africa, how that impact comes and shapes us or impacts our lives becomes slightly different. And this is where intersectionality then comes in. This is where decolonial intersection analysis then comes in, to try and understand how this issue that's affecting everybody in the world, how does it affect different people based on their identities wherever they are. So I'll just leave it at that, and we'll come back, I guess, to the other.
Yes. Well said, Doctor. And I think we'll bring in Prince on the same historical context to give his take. But yeah, well said. It's always good to frame the conversation within the right perimeters so that at least people have some historical context. They know what we are talking about, how we got here. And I appreciate other speakers there mentioning this has happened in other parts of the African continent. Many young Africans view Pan-Africanism as a historical concept rather than a living movement. How can its ideals be revived and translated into the practical realities for the current generation?
All right. Thank you so much, my brother Noah. Yes. So this is very important because Pan-Africanism, again, is a very essence through which Africa, in the first sense, from the anti-colonial seasons and anti-colonial periods, you know, in the early 60s when they had the Monrovia Casablanca debate. And I always say that if we had a very strong success during that conversation, Africa would not be where it is today. Africa is where it is today because of the fact that they didn't reach a very strong agreement during the Casablanca Monrovia debate and the first African Union Convention in 1963. Now, the African Union Commission on Human and People's Rights reported in April about a lot of things happening on the continent, in South Africa specifically. And of course, African Union sent some people there to do some things and all of that, but we know that it is not as effective as it ought to be. Like you said, the African Union is, because of the imperial interferences and all of that, it continues to be, a toothless bulldog, like we would, call it in the real sense. But now I like to be very clear, because we must see these conversations, and the best way to highlight conversations will be to make sure that we pinpoint the very occurrences and the things that are happening. Mainstream media would not report a lot of things because, of course, there are mainstream medias, and then we will probably not see a lot of things. But one of the places where you get a lot of things real time and a lot of things, in the real sense, will be go to spaces like X, where you see people record and post a lot of things real time. And this tells us the extent of damage that is currently happening. There are a lot of things that are happening on the continent in South Africa that is not, shown by mainstream media, which we understand to be, for some reason so. But then these conversations have continued to, drive us in the directions of not understanding the extent of things currently happening. So I've seen videos and, having some conversations with even my mentor PLO Lumumba regarding these conversations, and then you begin to see, and I think even what's his name, the EFF leader, I've forgotten his name, but here he also made a lot of conversations.
Julius Malema.
Right, Malema made a lot of conversations currently regarding the things that are currently happening on the continent in South Africa. These things are beyond, just surface level. It is true that the South Africans are complaining about a lot of things happening in the wrong directions for them. Ghana, Nigeria had similar conventions in Ghana, for instance, in 1993 when we had the Ghana-Moscow incidents. But it didn't get to this point where, you had to go after people, go to their homes, molest them, beat them. Some people even died from the beating. These are real-time experiences that we are not just, painting around. But one thing that I think we have not done effectively as a continent is telling our history to the next generation. And I can tell you categorically that the current incidents happening in South Africa is already raising a new generation of young people who will do worse than this current generation are doing. They will do worse. Now, if the current generation had the kind of foundations they had with Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, and all the foundational, all the very great leaders that they had, then they still went on to do what they are doing. If we don't tackle this, especially from the historical perspective and grounding our young people in the Pan-African ideals, it is possible that what is happening will continue to happen. And this is why people like Rodney wrote, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. This is why people like Fanon spoke about the wretched of the earth, because we need to look at the things on the continuous concurrent phase. So we need to teach history better. We need to go back to teach the ideals of history very, very effectively. And of course, I agree with every other person that has said the economy is important. Across board, we need to focus on the economy, make sure that the African economy is better across board. The people are getting jobs, the people are doing that, but we should be able to move from one part of Africa to the other without having issues. And so these are the kind of things that we should begin to look at. So the history is very important. And I will probably say that for me should be one of the most important things that we do on the continent to make sure that, such occurrences never happen again. Thank you so much.
Can you highlight some of the major sacrifices made by African countries, including Zambia and Tanzania, in support of South Africa's liberation struggle?
Yeah, thank you so much, Noah. Before I go to that, just a minute to say that when you start seeing an Ethiopian refugee or undocumented immigrant come to South Africa and establish a successful, whether supermarket, whether car wash and all that, then it shows that the broad-based black economic empowerment program that the South Africa has been running has reached an entrepreneurial cul-de-sac. It means that it has really failed and needs reassessing, because it shows that the illegal or the undocumented Ethiopian has seen a very missing gap, economic gap, that they are really exploiting beyond the labor dynamics. So it's something that we really need to look at. Now, I will just base on one country as an example to show how really the South African anti-apartheid struggle was not actually a South African struggle, that it was an African struggle. Moderator, you've talked about countries like which were the front line, countries like Zambia, which actually were the headquarters, where the Mkotha Wesinzwe and the ANC were really located in Zambia. MK had an active military training camp in Angola. The first commander of the MK, Nelson Madiba, was trained by Ethiopia. And actually, the first pistol that he owned, together with 200 ammunitions, were actually given to him by Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. But perhaps even with the zeal and the spirit of our brothers from South Africa, without support from other African countries, I think the question of South African liberation might have taken much more longer than it even took. When you look at Nigeria, perhaps, and Nigeria has been one of the countries that actually has been at loggerheads in terms of when you talk about the question of xenophobia or Afrophobia, whatever language we might want to use, Nigeria comes first. And there is perhaps no country that really sacrificed much more for the South African cause than Nigeria. According to the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa, every year, Nigeria paid up to $5 million annually to support the ANC, by then, which was based in Zambia. When you reach the streets of Nigeria and you ask about the Mandela tax, there was a tax that Olusegun Obasanjo, and Bible just to say, the $5 million annual tax was actually started in 1970s, way back, and up to almost 20 years, Nigeria was supporting this cause, and this money was being collected annually. But just to say, when you look at the taxes that the Nigerian government introduced, there is what they called the Mandela tax. And with this tax from 1976, each public servant and civil servant was taxed a mandatory 2% of their salary. And within the 8 months when the Mandela tax was established, $10.5 million had been actually generated. Apart from that, when you look at a country like Nigeria, including Ethiopia, Nigeria remained a safe haven for many of the South African, many of the MK, Mkotha Wesinzwe and ANC political commanders, but also freedom fighters who were actually being persecuted by the South African apartheid regime. And for example, close to 300 passports were given to South Africans by Nigerians, including when you look at the infamous Hector Peterson time when Mbuisa, I think Makubu, was persecuted by the South African government. He found refuge in Nigeria. And lastly, also to say, a country like Nigeria actually sacrificed its economic freedom in terms of refusing to sell oil to the white South African apartheid government. So when we look at the oneness and the self-sacrifice that we saw, I term it as this was based on Ubuntu, the Pan-Africanism we really saw by saying that my brother is suffering, I cannot really enjoy when my brother is suffering, and it should not be seen like it is an IOU kind of transactional relationship. No, and this is where I say it is okay for the young South Africans not to actually be, again, it would be wrong for us as Africans to tell young South Africans that, well, your freedom was fought by us, we contributed to this. Well, that might be also a bit unfortunate and unfair. So it should not be seen as if it is an IOU. Now that we have supported and sacrificed for your struggle, we should also come again and contribute to the same economic challenges and the same bad governance issues that you were fighting during the genocide. during the apartheid regime. So those again are the nuances that we need to look into. But the spirit of Ubuntu, the spirit of oneness, the spirit of Pan-Africanism that made countries to sacrifice, like you're saying, moderator, countries like Zambia had to almost face economic collapse because of the cause of South Africa. That is something that we need to really build on and keep shining the light upon for the young people to be able to see and take some lessons. Thank you.
Yes, well said, well said. The freedom of South Africa was a coordinated effort by countless African countries. So thank you for sharing that. So now, Kabamanya, here is a question. So this one is on the migration, development, and economic realities. So the question for you, sir, is critics often argue that migrants take jobs and strain public resources. What does the evidence actually tell us about the economic impact of migration in Africa?
Well, thank you, my brother. And this is a good question, but actually we have heard a lot about the economic structure and what actually influenced the economy of South Africa. But maybe before going into answering the question, I should address the thing of or the fact of how the neoliberal economy works and in relation to job, and if the neoliberal economics can bring jobs to the people. The one thing we should understand is that the neoliberal economics, the interest is not to create job. The interest is to accumulate wealth. It doesn't matter whether you will get job in that process or you don't get job in that process. The interest is to accumulate wealth, to make much more profit. So that's one of the workings of the neoliberal economics. But the other thing is, we can say, differentiating people, putting people into classes and groups. I don't want to use the word classes because the way things move in South Africa now, in the current protest, I don't see the way classes operate. But dividing people into groups, say the employed groups, the so-called informal groups. I don't use the word informal very consciously because when you say informal, is relative to the formal capitalist economy. So you leave out those farmers and everything. So I don't use the word informal. So if you divide them, then it's easier to exploit them. So that's how it works in a brief. Now let's go to the impact of migrant and what the evidence says. And I will use South Africa to talk about this. If you look at the statistics, South Africa, it has 2.4 million migrants, both the documented and undocumented migrants. So if you have 2.4 million migrants and you have an employment of 8.1 million people unemployed, even if you take out these 2.5 million out, you will still have 5+ million of unemployed people. And then now come to see, is this the migrant, the internal moving into South Africa cause problem to jobs, or is other system that causing problem to job? The answer is simple. Is another system that actually constructed in a way of accumulating wealth from the workings of from the labor of the people. So if you are looking at the job used as a text of hatred and a text of justifying expelling foreigners, this is not a true claim. And we see it every day in everywhere, and we see it in Tanzania also, because now in Tanzania, there is a tension between the Tanzania mainland and Zanzibar. And yesterday I was looking at what was happening in Zanzibar, and the argument was, these are mainland people, they are taking our jobs. And I said, these jobs cannot be a justification because it's not the engine of the economy you're operating in. So that's another business. But what we see now is that we are trying to confront I can say the artificial problem or the tips of the iceberg and other things, we leave it down. And that's why I was saying, if this question of they are taking our jobs, they are criminals and they're all that, without confronting the economic systems that we are living in, then this problem will continue and will grow to the point that we cannot even attack it. we have seen in South Africa, people have said several times, if we go back to history, that South Africa was actually under colonialism and apartheid system. Or these systems actually took all the wealth to individual, to very small group. I can tell you now, South Africa is only 0.1%, which is owning 25% of the national wealth. Now you can see that if you have, and this I will tell you, and there is evidence that this 25%, actually, if you go within that 25%, you are going to find 5 billionaires that controlling that economy. And that means that 1% is actually 5 people controlling all the wealth of South Africa. So you can see now that you don't need to talk about job without talking about what is the superstructure, what is the economic relations of South Africa. So I'm going back to history. So the apartheid created such type of economy. That type of economy were not altered during the independence of South Africa. So it remained intact. And it continued to function until now. And very dangerous thing is that South Africa got the majority rule at the time the structural adjustment system was already in the continent and operating strongly. So it carries the apartheid structures, the structural adjustment structures, the neoliberal policies, and now trying to struggle to rebuild the country and to give people jobs. And in a real sense, you cannot give jobs with those kind of structures. That's the one thing. The other thing that's actually I see we are using job to consolidate it is this the race question, the race hierarchies, which is an engine of capitalism. Now we are attacking the Africans and say, okay, the Africans, they are taking our jobs, but we are not attacking the white people, the Indian people. So now you see the relations of race moves from saying the black are inferior and the white are superior. Now it's the black thinking that the black within themselves, the foreigners, they are inferior to them. So you see how these kind of hierarchies continue to exploit people and push them to think that what you need to get is the job. And that's why I was saying that I was using the term, the so-called describing job, because if you don't own means of production, and then you will continue relying on jobs, which is actually another form of exploitation. Maybe when times are out, I can talk about it. So what you are making, you are saying capitalism should continue exploiting and exploiting and exploit more without saying, no, we need to change this economic system so that we can put the means of production in the hand of the working people, so that if someone owns a small portion of farm, he has freedom on that portion of farm. If someone is selling, is riding motorcycle, whatever, he has freedom of doing that, and he control what comes out of that. But if you say, okay, we don't get jobs in the restaurant, what you are saying, I am not getting job to give profit to that restaurant owner. So that's I say, this is the thing we should understand in depth. So if you look at what is happening around the continent, the conversation among the youth, and I don't know, but actually, I always read about Marx and all things. But if you look at the discussion in the continent about the way youth talk about things, they say, oh, we have no jobs. We have no, the thing they should be talking, we have no control of means of production. So if you are saying, I was looking at some of the villages, and you see there is some people starting imagining owning a big chunk of land in the village, and then the rest, they have no rent. They said, what are they going to do? Actually, they're going to be labor of this person. What does it mean? Then you will be saying, I have no job. But no, you have not. It's not the question of job. It's the question of alienation from production. You are being alienated from the production process. I think I should stop here. Thank you. And then maybe the other question I can go.
So the question for you is, young people are often both the most vulnerable to unemployment and the most active participants in social movements. What role can they play in combating xenophobia and promoting social cohesion?
Thank you. Please, I hope you can hear me, please.
Yes, sir. Proceed. Yes.
Yes, sir. Proceed. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. The first basic thing we must note is that the youth are not the future, are not just the future, is they actually the battlefield for us to know whether they are the social cohesion war will be lost or won. That's the first basic thing we need to notice of. The reason being that the youth happen to be the thread that is used to woven whatsoever society, organization, or institution that is built. Coming to South Africa, I believe the basic thing is this, and even generally all over Africa, there are three basic things that we must first take note of. The first one being that we have what we call identity vacuum. Every youth see himself or herself basically belonging to one tribe or ethnicity, then later to a nationality, maybe Nigerian, South African, and so on and so forth. And the third one is being an African. So based on that, they actually find it hard most often to be able to align specifically to what will be best for them. And then in crisis, at every point in time, they do resort. They do normally go back to the ethnic, what do you call it? They do normally go back to that of the ethnic. So having said that, the another thing we had is that, we are in the digital world, whereby everybody at every point in time, maybe on the internet, on social media, whenever something happens, and then one of the first things they do want to know is that person a Nigerian? Is it a South African? So automatically, they do normally have that tendency to follow suit or to actually support the person that have the same nationality with them or the same ethnicity with them. The third one that is lacking also in the African citizen, and we drive everything on later to South Africa, is that the ego gap. I think one of the first basic things that I believe the leader of South African did not actually do well was that, there were stories about Soweto, there were stories about Robben Island and so on and so forth, but most of the contributions of other African countries were at the footnotes. In Nigeria, in fact, almost everybody then until now know about Mandela. We do always have that about this and that. But one of the first basic things about the youth then, and I believe specifically for South Africa, was that the story was not well told to South African youth. That was one of the first basic things. Having said that, yes, we have a generation that fought for liberation, for freedom. The youth that we have now, they were only, maybe to some extent, they heard the story from other people. But the basic thing is that how far the government, and even that are the aim at today, how far did they institutionalize Pan-Africanism in whatsoever thing they are doing? Yes, I can remember Thabo Mbeki, whatsoever, all those speeches made in the African Union. But the basic thing is that were they institutionalized within South Africa? Because if they were institutionalized, one of the first basic things that will actually occur is that every time they have somebody close to them, they won't be using the word like foreigner, 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 foreigner. I saw a news this morning. One of the South African youth said, I hate foreigners. I hate foreigners. Yeah, that is a statement out of emotion, but basically we need to know that it's just ordinary emotional statement. It's a statement that actually points to one thing. One, the word foreigners there. The second one is the word hate. The reason is that those that are non-South Africans have already been labeled in such a way that they are seen as enemy instead of partners in progress for the South Africa. I'm really happy that the person that the last speaker actually made some things clear. And one of the things that I believe the person actually made clear was that the economy is very key, is germane to anything that happened in the country. And as I said earlier, the actual problem we are having in South Africa is what we call institutional disequilibrium. The reason being that when the independence was got, it led to democracy, mass democracy, whereby you can vote, you can do this, you can do that. But basically, it's the actual infrastructure that were put in place, the institutions that were put in place were not dismantled by Nelson Mandela, by Mbeki. All those things were not dismantled. They are still there, even as are today. That is why you have people that can actually have access to some certain employment, certain level of economic activities. All those things also have been dismantled. The third one is that of social institution too, were not handled. So instead of it also actually have what we call should have been called institutional synchronization. What we have is that we now have this equilibrium. That yes, there is freedom. People can talk, they can vote, they can do that. But the outcome out of that is nowhere to be found. It's nowhere to be found. So automatically, as I said earlier, the youth will ask questions. Yes, I can vote, I have freedom, but the basic thing is that I'm in poverty. And you don't tell somebody that is hungry, you don't tell somebody that is hungry about Pan-Africanism. It's not done. The first thing is that thing has to be taken care of. All those structures, institutional structures that are still in place, the government and the leaders of thought in South Africa have to do something about that. Now, what can the youth do on their own? Because we're actually talking about the youth. And then the youth are the one that will lay the foundation for what will happen in the near future. Some of the basic things that can be done by the youth is that we can have, luckily we have what we are in the digital world, we can have what we call it, one Africa, one class. You and I can actually come up with such a thing whereby we have a platform whereby all African citizens can actually come in and involve in several projects. And in that project, what we are going to have is that you are not going to have people in groups. And in each of the groups, you now have people from different countries in a group. And you know there is in contact theory, somebody that you have continuous contact with time, the prejudice you have against that person will go down. That is certainty. But the problem is that what we've been having is that the contacts that you have in most of the African countries, and specifically South Africa, is that contact, there are some basic conditions that must be fulfilled that are not yet fulfilled there. One of the first things is that there must be equal status. Every citizen and the residents must have equal status, having access to some basic things. The second one is that the government must ensure there is healthy competition. The third one, that there must be common goal. That is what is actually missing. If Africans youth can actually say that all other Africans that are in South Africa, they are here to also help us to build Africa. Because it is when there is no social cohesion, that is when people see people from other countries as foreigners. That is when you have divisions. But if they can say that these are not just foreigners, they are here to also help us to build. Now, to support the statistic support provided by the earlier speaker, do you know statistics actually prove it that for every migrant, for every informal sector, 2 jobs are created for the South Africa? I don't know whether you know that. These people don't know all such things. That the migrants are even contributing to South Africa, and that is fact of reality in every country. Another thing is that when you are having people from different diverse background, cultural background, when they come together, you tend to have innovation. You tend to have innovation. you tend to have improvement in entrepreneurship skill. And then one of the first basic thing I believe that can also be done is that, you see, I think what the South African living South African face to actually realize is this. Yes, the foreigners that are in their land actually have three basic things that may work for them so well. Number one is that entrepreneurial skill. So, you know, somebody that lives on a place and come to another place will always try to come up with a way to survive. So most of the time, such a thing normally leads to
all right, so we may
entrepreneurial skill and actually fall back on the network, on the net connection they have within their community from where they are coming from. They can also fall back on that. So what the government or the youth leader ought to have done is coming out with a better alternative in order, especially coming up with credits, or coming up with different, what do you call it, a platform to actually train South Africans on how to acquire entrepreneurial skills and some other things, and how they do normally communicate, how they do normally liaise, how they do normally form joint ventures. All those things will help them to actually be a stakeholder in the community. So having said that, there are a lot of ways for the youth to ensure that they are stakeholders in their own country. As I told you before, I mentioned that on African citizenship. That is, yes, I should not forget this. What of if the government, of South Africa and with other African countries come up with national youth service, like the way that is being done in Nigeria, whereby you have to move from one part of Nigeria to another side to serve. And in the process, you are exposed to different culture, different skills, different things. And then in this case now, what I would advise that the youth in South Africa or the government or non-governmental organization can actually do is that if they can actually come together and establish such a thing, whereby you now have people from different areas coming together to work as a team. On a certain project, maybe for community development, building a school or channeling the water and doing all such things. Whoever that you work with to solve a solution is your brother. And at every point in time, you always have that feeling of brotherliness or brotherhood with the person. So those are the things that I think that the South African youths and leaders, South African youth generally, and South African youth leaders and the traditional leaders, those are the things I believe that they can do in order to check against xenophobic. Having said that, it is very important that we realize one thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you want to walk down.
Is my time up?
Yeah, you can finalize.
Yeah, we must take note of one thing. We had the generation that fought for freedom in Africa. This generation must create inclusive growth for the whole Africa. Not exclusive, not this place belongs to us. It is when we do not fail in that respect that the future generation, the next generation, will be able to inherit institutions that help to sustain growth and develop in Africa. And we cannot do without one another. Thank you.
The vision for Agenda 2063 speaks of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa. What concrete steps must African leaders and citizens take today to make this vision a reality?
Thank you so much, for your question. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Proceed.
Okay, perfect. So to make this vision a reality, first of all, it's not only an effort on the side of our leaders but also to the citizens all of us as Africans. So to turn this thing into a reality, what we must do as Africans is to move from talking about unity and actually practicing it. Most of the times we have them in books, but if you walk into these African countries, you see that things are very different on the ground. Though in the books it's well stated, well written, if you go to the internet and research about it, it's well perfectly written, but practicing it is where I think Africans should draw the line. um, which means making it easier for Africans to trade once we have this unity in practice. Traveling will be very easy for us as Africans and working across borders without unnecessary barriers. There are some African countries where if you go, you still need a lot of things. You're disturbed at the borders to get this document, these other ones. But if you get people from Europe, some even come to African countries without visas, or they're given visas in the internet. But as an African child, you have to pay several dollars to get this visa to go to a country, even if it's just for visiting. So yeah, integration, honestly, it has to be real, not something that we say in speeches. We see many of our leaders during these conferences, they have perfectly written speeches, but the reality of things are just so different. So you just have to live in a reality world. Secondly, we have to seriously invest in young people, because these are the people who are going to lead us in several years to come. Not just several, but in the next 5 years, 2 years, young people are coming up and they're the ones who are going to live. So African being a very young continent, and if we actually also don't create jobs and support innovation and improve education to these young people, we're actually wasting our biggest resources um, as a continent. So without education, actually, we cannot have peace, because there is a saying I believe in that an educated nation cannot know what democracy is. So, for democracy to be practiced, so for us to have peace, we have to also invest in these young people through education and stuff, jobs. Because once a young people doesn't have a job, that mind becomes very idle, and that's when we have the crazy mindsets. The crime rates will eventually increase, and this is very evident in a lot of African countries. Um, Also, another thing that I think is very important in this, to have this vision of the agenda 2063, sorry, come to a reality, is good governance. For example, when corruption is controlled and our leaders are accountable and for what they do, and development actually reaches the people, not reaching their pockets. We have very many resources, but we find that 1% of the population are the ones that benefit from all this, whilst the rest of African people, the citizens, like, they are nowhere to be found. Even if you have the funds, you find that most of our African leaders, they think of themselves first before thinking about the rest of the people. So you see, development goes to one specific place and leaving the rest of the places undeveloped. So it's like it's either you're rich or poor in Africa. So good governance, getting rid of corruption, whereby I don't have to go to this specific office to pay this amount of fee in order to get a certain service. This can help us get to this an integrated and prosperous, peaceful Africa as well. At the same time, we can't ignore peace, literally. Looking currently, I would say more than 5 African states are not in a very peaceful state currently, which means without stability, nothing will actually work. So there has to be a strong conflict resolution that is more effective to prevent violence within and between our countries. We have DRC Congo. they're always in conflict 24/7. You wake up today, you find out this state in the DRC has these issues. And we have the African Union. These people go for these conferences daily. They use funds from African nations. I don't know what they discuss there. Maybe, like, it's just sad because these people have been in conflict for the last decade, and there is no solution that our African leaders have been able to come up with, you know. So in order to have this agenda fulfilled by then, I think most of our leaders need to change on this. And also as citizens, actually, because majority, most of the tasks belong to us. So we have a very strong role to play, whereby we need to reject things like xenophobia, division, and start seeing each other as Africans first before seeing this person as a job snatcher, as someone who is there to take your opportunity. You seeing this person as your enemy, then rather than seeing this one as a family, as a brother, as a sister from another mother, from another nation. So yeah, things like this, once they're stopped, a peaceful Africa is definitely along the way. We will see it. Not, we won't hear it, won't become a dream, but it will become a reality. Um, uh, okay, I would say that unity is not about, it's not a government project actually. It's also a lot on our mindset as well. If we go with this thing that Africa can never be peaceful, we can never unite, then it will never. So we also have to do a lot of belief in ourselves. We have to have a shift of mindset as citizens of Africa. And so if we change how we see each other as well, we can really move forward into a peaceful and a prosperous Africa that we want to have in the next few years that comes. Yeah, that's my take on that. Thank you.
What policy measures should South African authorities prioritize to address xenophobia while also responding to legitimate public concerns about jobs, security, service delivery?
Thank you, Brother Noah. So this question contains a tension that is worth naming directly, right? This question assumes that addressing xenophobia and responding to legitimate public concerns are two competing demands. Now, I want to challenge that assumption because the best policies actually do both simultaneously. Let me walk through these 4 priority areas. Now, the first priority that the South African government needs to do is law enforcement reform. That's the first priority because the South African Constitution protects every person on the South African soil. That is in our Constitution. It does not say citizens. It says protects every person on the South African soil. And that is not a technicality, it is a value statement. Any government serious about xenophobia must ensure that the SAPS, like South African Police Service, has dedicated capacity and clear mandates to protect migrant communities during periods of tension like we have right now, in the sense that perpetrators of xenophobic violence are prosecuted, not just arrested and released, and that political leaders must stop providing cover for mobs by expressing sympathy for their frustrations before a single sentence about the rights of victims, right? We need to speak about the rights of victims and we need to enforce the law. We definitely have to do that because criminality, whether it's done to a person that is legal in South Africa or not legal in South Africa, criminality is criminality. So the second priority then is immigration system investment, right? The Department of Home Affairs is chronically overwhelmed. Chronically overwhelmed. Let me give you an example. South Africa has two main things when it comes to immigration. One, we have asylum seekers. Now, these asylum seekers are not only coming from South Africa, they're even coming from Asia. We have quite a number of people that are coming from Pakistan and Bangladesh. And those people are using the asylum seeker mechanism that we have within our Department of Home Affairs policies. Now, that has a huge backlog. What that results in, it results in people staying in South Africa, even though they're not documented, because they don't have the asylum seeker certificate. They have to stay here until they get it. Now, we need to make sure that we put investment and we modernize those systems just that we can process those people as quickly as possible, because as soon as they are documented in South Africa, then they're able to participate in the economy of South Africa. Right, and then the third priority is community integration at the municipal level. In South Africa, we have the parliament, you have the provinces, you have metropolitan municipalities, which are the bigger ones, then you have the local municipalities. Now, where we're talking about is at the municipal level, where social tension is highest. If you look at Johannesburg, eThekwini, which is Durban, Cape Town, these are where the tensions are coming at when we're looking at things like xenophobia. And this means community policing forums that include migrant representatives, multilingual service delivery points, and conflict mediation infrastructure before tensions escalate. Prevention is always cheaper than response. We've had xenophobic incidents, and I've said this before. We've had them since 1994, and the worst ones were in 2008, actually, where quite a number of people lost their lives. Right now, the fourth priority then is honest political communication. The legitimate concerns about unemployment, service delivery failures, and crime must be addressed, but they must be addressed honestly. Honestly, saying that an undocumented migrant that is in South Africa must leave so you can get better services at a clinic, it doesn't, even if they leave, it's not going to solve the fact that that clinic is underfunded. That school is underfunded. Those kids still do not have desks. Whether the migrants leave or stay, that infrastructure is still dilapidating, and we need to resolve that. And actually, in economics, there is a term called a lump of labor fallacy. A lump of labor fallacy. That means this idea that if we get rid of undocumented migrants in South Africa, all of a sudden it's going to create jobs for South Africans. It's a fallacy. It does not happen. If in my house I've employed a domestic worker from Lesotho, and all of them are asked to leave, right? Now I need to look for a South African. I may not, I may find one, but I may find someone who will say, no, actually, I want this kind of money, and I don't have that money, but I do need the help, right? So these are the things that we're currently dealing with, and these are the things where our political leadership is not leading us in the way that they're supposed to be leading us, right? So these are the things that we need to do as South Africans and all countries around the world, because xenophobic attacks do not only happen around the world. And we also need to be cognizant of the fact that there are also external parties that are good at infiltrating other countries to create such things. If you look at the number of deaths that happened in Iran this year, that was infiltrated by other people not from Iran. And the government of Iran had to actually enforce their law to say, these things are not welcome here. That was not done because the people of Iran were hungry or whatever the case may be, even though those circumstances are there. So the number one thing that we need to do as a policy is let's enforce the rule of law. That's the responsibility of government. And then the second thing is, let's make sure that we're communicating to our citizens from the government perspective, right? Together with the SADC leaders. This is very important. Together with the SADC leaders. One of the complaints that we've received from from the Department of International Relations is that there is no cooperation from the other African countries. Now, when speaking about African migrants specifically, there is no coordination. If they're trying to contact Mozambican government to say, we have 1,000 people, we want to bring them back to Mozambique, there is no cooperation when it comes to that. And there needs to be that cooperation. But the most important cooperation that needs to happen between these leaders in the SADC region and in Africa as a whole is on development. Because no matter how much I've heard my brothers and sisters saying, let's educate these people about the importance of the African countries and African people in helping South Africa become independent in 1994. Yes, that's very important. But if these people are hungry right now, that information is not going to do anything for them. It will not. What they will want the next thing they can blame for what they're going through, which is exactly what is happening right now. As I said initially, this is a misguided anger. It should not be directed at undocumented migrants. Even though they're claiming it as undocumented migrants, it's not undocumented migrants. It's foreigners in general. And this is happening in areas where people are actually feeling the effects of inequality, the effects of unemployment, the effects of dilapidated infrastructure, right? The fact that they may get rid of undocumented migrants is not going to fix that pipe that burst of sewage. That's not working. It's not. We should not kid ourselves about that. So it's important then, as part of our government policy, that government gets ahead of these things, put proper solutions in place in order to make sure that such things do not happen again, because xenophobic attacks have happened for quite some time. They need to educate our people that there's the protocols that they've signed with the African Union to say there must be free movement of persons and free movement of goods. Now these people are going to come here. But what we will do, we will focus on developing our economies. And even our counterparts in other countries, we need to focus on development. Development is the number one thing that will solve us, because these xenophobic attacks happen in South Africa. They happen in areas where people need jobs. They need money. They are hungry. They don't happen in affluent areas where we actually have quite a number of people. Like in the area that I live in the Sandton region, which is normally called the richest square mile in Africa. Here we see people from all walks of life, and there's no xenophobic attacks. Why? Because people here have the means. The problem here is economical. It's not education. It's not all of these things. But then what we need the most is the government policy and the political will to drive the solutions that need to be driven. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you. That's well said, my brother. The solution, like you said, it's development for the African continent, so that people are not in the first place able to move to other countries. So that is well said. On this topic, understanding the current xenophobia crisis. So give us an overview as we are finalizing the conversation, what we are dealing with here. So, and your specific question you can speak to is, what are the main drivers behind the current anti-foreigner sentiments in South Africa, and how much of it is rooted in perception versus in reality? Thank you.
All right. Thank you once again, moderator, and massive gratitude to all the panelists who've been wonderful, who've shared wonderful views in relation of this. And what I loved in terms of all the contributions, everybody is in alignment in terms of the importance of our continent unifying. So, look, I'm going to highlight a number of things, and again, this is based on research in terms of, one, social media posts, formal media briefings that have been shared by the protesters, and as well as news, so formal news spaces and a number of other platforms, but more so including some of the conversations or the report by the South African Human Rights Commission, which hosted an Imbizo in May in the attempt to really understand what is going on in South Africa right now. So for those who are interested, if you can go to the South African Human Rights Commission, you will find basically a summary of what the concerns that were raised by the protesters or by South Africans who are, partaking in these protests today. So one, they raised, issues around escalating crime, which basically, for example, they're talking about organized crime that is affecting their communities, and the major concerns that they were highlighting were issues around drugs, unlawful mining, and prostitution rings, which basically have increased in the country, right? And what needs to be understood here is, for example, in terms of drugs, right? I mean, there are certain, drug busts that were that were done recently. I think the South African police has been relatively busy in terms of trying to fight drugs. So we had some Mexicans who, or South Americans to be more specific, or rather broad, who were found to actually were, busy with some a factory that actually manufactures drugs in South Africa in the Northwest, right? And I'm highlighting this because a lot of the times there have been the arguments that, oh no, Nigerians are actually involved in selling drugs. Of course, there are a few of them there and there, and it's not just Nigerians. And I think that's quite important. South Africans, or the drug business or the drug cartel in South Africa would not survive without South Africans who are part of it. I think that's something that needs to be clarified. And I think what then now happens is communities, especially because these are the city centers, as Anele mentioned, right? These tensions are happening in metropoles and city centers. And in those areas, you do see a lot of migrant communities, right? So at the face value, in terms of whoever that person that you see on the streets probably selling drugs to somebody, you may then see a non-South African and then assume that actually they are the behind or the kingpin of the entire thing. And then in terms of crime, yes, it's been a contentious, and I'm going to share, and I'm very open to sharing the links as well. So, some of the people are saying, oh no, crime is caused by foreigners, etc., and all of that. I think it's very contestable. It is contestable in the sense that you cannot blame the entire crime sort of crisis in South Africa on migrants. At the same time, we can't also deny the criminal activities of some of our non-South African migrants in South Africa. I think that's also because these two things can exist at the same time. And I think the conversation right now is, and I see this with a lot of the conversations on social media when other fellow Africans say, we actually understand what you're saying, right? Oh, and then, for example, I remember one Nigerian sister saying, I think we need to also be clear for us as Nigerians living in South Africa, that also we need to speak against some of what our brothers are doing in South Africa, right? And I would see then the posts, the comments in those kinds of videos where South Africans are saying, thank you for seeing us. Thank you for actually hearing what we are saying, right? And so, because these are some of the issues that exist. And again, in this conversation, we need to be balanced. We can't just say, oh no, take side, and then actually hide the other reality, which is true. And statistics, as I've mentioned, so the 2024-2025 crime statistics actually show that over 60%, and again, I will share this data from the South African government. If you Google it, you'll find it. Over 60% of the crimes that were committed in 2024-25 cycle were actually non-South Africans, right? Again, I will share this data from the South African Authority. All right. And also there's data showing from the Constitutional Court as well. The Department of Justice, broadly, that's not what their real name is. But they also highlighted that about South Africa spends over 76.1 million last year on basically translations, right? Translations for people who are basically in court for crimes that, you know, so that particular translation representation. So that on its own, it sort of feeds into this belief that people had, whatever arguments that they have around whatever is happening. And the other thing in relation to so there are certain other crimes that are not so evident. So for example, such as human trafficking. You know, one of my brothers mentioned earlier that, oh no, you have a Ethiopian coming into South Africa and they become a successful entrepreneur. The thing is, don't assume that every single Ethiopian owned shop is individually owned. That is a very problematic assumption, because you do have, for example, cartels that actually do exist. You'll find that I may be South African, right? I open a shop, say, for example, here in Tanzania, and then I bring South Africans from South Africans into Tanzania, and I pay, right, for their trip. And when they come to South Africa, they actually have to work for free. Right? Those are the realities. And some of these workers then actually end up living in the back of those shops. Again, these are documented research. You can actually sort of Google this and then find the information. So those are some of the challenges. There's a lot of human trafficking that's involved here. So that's why it is important that when we have this conversation, also think about the rights and the protections of, right, the violations of the human rights of some of our fellow Africans. And again, also with, for example, some of the salons in South Africa, for example, some of our fellow Africans, for example, Ghanaians who have salons in South Africa, similar thing. You buy a ticket for somebody to come and work in your salon, and essentially you withhold their passport. And with some of the immigrants who left South Africa, the first 300 that left, they found that actually that was some of the situation, right? So it's not that people actually wanted to stay and overstay in South Africa, but you find that their passports were taken away from them by their fellow countrymen who brought them into South Africa to actually work in these saloons. So again, the assumption that it is every person that you see there is individually owning the salons, that is not the case. That is not always the case, right? So you might find a small group of people who then also exploit the vulnerabilities of our fellow Africans. Hence, that's why earlier I said, what we are witnessing here is also relatively the failure of the left, because the left should be actually coming together to ensure that all workers, whether in South Africa, whether outside of the continent, we collectively ensure that our workers are protected. And ULIT then elevated the conversation. And I think it seems like, you know, we didn't rise up to what he was actually introducing to us by saying what the conversation should be about should no longer really about workers and employment, but it should be about ownership of the means of production. I mean, that is even more powerful in terms of what our end goal is. And that's why I was earlier, when I was talking about Pan-Africanism and permutation of Pan-Africanism, right? Or Pan-African unification, that it's important that we understand, is it a neoliberal version or a socialist version that ULIT actually was alluding to, all right? Whereby we actually are going to address the class divides. And then, of course, yes, issues around poor service delivery, poor school placing, strained healthcare, and all of that. So in this case, again, we're trying to understand again, right? And please, I need everybody to understand this. So this is based on research of what the people are saying. Again, you can find this on the South African Human Rights Commission, all right? So then what the argument is, so for example, I don't know if most of you saw this here with the school children, you know, from migrant children who were basically being, you know, escorted out, actually aggressively and traumatically being, you know, sort of chased out of schools and all of that. So that issue emerges from earlier this year when apparently the same school in Durban, whereby their parents, South African parents, were saying our children cannot find schools, yet in this particular school we have migrants. And the misunderstanding there, which is also based on misinformation, I guess, was this assumption that the whole school was actually sort of, for example, only taking migrant children, which is the argument that was being made. And that was actually the South African Basic Education Department debunked that actually that's not true. Right. So out of, for example, I think the school had the capacity to take 1,500 and something learners, and only 670 of them were from immigrants. right? So, which then debunks this idea that none of the, sort of the children at that school were actually South Africans. So again, the state coming in to debunk those myths. And again, the issue then comes up, and which basically what the people were saying is, but then in this case, why isn't that South African children are not being prioritized, right? So that then became their argument. But the good thing is the South African government did find placing for those children, so they are in school right now. And as it was mentioned, our constitution in South Africa covers everyone. Whether you're in South Africa legally, you're an undocumented immigrant, we do not stop children from going to school because that's our constitution, right? Our constitution basically, lays it out that everyone in the country, right? And the other thing that I want to highlight from this, which I also think, it's been something that's been grappling my mind, is, for example, we have had a lot of, for example, some young Malawians, families who are then, they have children in South Africa, were born in South Africa, and they get schooled in South Africa. And I think this is where other African countries have, for example, Malawi should actually be taking advantage of this. The fact that South Africa is actually educating, right? So it's taking on the social infrastructure responsibility of educating some of its citizens. And instead of the Malawi, I would wish that the Malawian government would actually then say, okay, now South Africa, you've done this. How then now do we bring these children and then either fund them further for their education, right? Or help them to be more regularized or more documented, like help them to be documented so that they're able to study further. Because what then happens in South Africa right now is you'd have a child that the South African government educates from grade R to up until grade 12, which is, by the way, the reason why a person in South Africa will not know what a GPA is. We don't use GPA system, right? We have a matriculation, so it's basically matriculation. So you get educated up until that for free. And then after that, because you're not documented, right, it then becomes difficult for you to move on to higher educations because you're applying to university. If you don't have documents, literally the system is automatically going to sideline your application, right? So what there needs to happen is the governments, such as the Malawian government, should then see a way to actually assist its citizens and then ensure that they're actually educated above, right, so higher education, get into the higher education space, whether in South Africa or wherever. But the idea is we need to not just leave that level of empowerment there, but then also beyond, so that we have other equipped Malawians who then can go back and actually help build the country. Right. And then the other thing is in terms of the spaza shop, and I've partly, sort of mentioned this. I think what then these immigrants are saying, South Africans, I'm calling South African immigrants, what the South Africans are saying is that, look, the spaza shops, street vendors, salons, etc. These have created competition with locals to a point that, it has become relatively difficult for them to actually survive, right? And in some instances, there've also been sort of elements of criminality as well. Again, organized criminality, which then involves, for example, I think this year there was a South African young person who started a spaza shop and then he was kidnapped by Ethiopians. So there's also a turf in that space that cannot be denied, right? And sort of also some really problematic competition. Issues around price fixing, etc. that happens in the space which then make South African businesses then unable to survive. So it's not necessarily an entrepreneurial issue, solely entrepreneurial skills issue. There are all the other elements that I would invite fellow Africans and other researchers to actually try and understand what is going on in there. And then, of course, then the South Africans were also highlighting that, the issues around, for example, certain formal business in South Africa, hiring non-South Africans, in the process violating immigration law and labor laws. For example, having, sort of non-South Africans who are working in restaurants, in various farms, etc., etc. So these are the things that are saying, and they're saying, look, according to the law, immigration law, as well as labor law, these things are not allowed to happen. right? So even if, say, for example, all of us here are saying, oh no, there's nothing wrong with, for example, an undocumented immigrant coming from elsewhere and then starting a salon in South Africa. But what then happens is, in that case, is somebody coming in on a tourist visa and then starting a business, then on its own is actually wrong in South Africa. It is against the law. And we should equally reprimand it. Now, what is different? What is different, which then, in my head as everyone was speaking, and especially when we were talking about this idea, what Pan-Africanism, right? And particularly Pan-Africanism in practice today, and not Pan-Africanism as in the past. And I think I was happy that Anele mentioned this, that even if you were to have all sorts of movies, and which is basically, right, or conversations, because this keeps on coming up, where people are saying, but we helped you do this, we helped you with this, we helped you with the liberation. And you are saying this to people who are losing faith on the ANC, right? Because all of that assistance was towards the liberation movement, which essentially dominated by the ANC, right? So now you're finding people that you're telling them, yes, we helped Mandela, we helped Thabo Mbeki, we helped so-and-so, who are part of the ANC. And the very same people in the country right now are very angry with the ANC because of poor governance, because of poor service delivery, because of issues around jobs, because et cetera, again, the political economy choices that were made by the ANC, right? So in a sense, what then we need to be shifting the conversation to in this contemporary times is, let us understand that all of us as Africans, we're in the same boat. Number one. Number two, what then becomes the dividend of us uniting today economically? Right. So if we all of us all of a sudden became one continent, this then gives us power also to then challenge some of the the impact and the sort of, I guess, foreign forces that are keeping Africa where it is today, right? So if, say, for example, XY country is able to manipulate, for example, a country like a very small country such as Comoros, Malawi, Lesotho, to then say, you are going to do this, for example. But then if we come together collectively, we are going to speak with one voice, and then we will be able to fight back. And of course, in that fighting back and speaking with one voice, also we don't want problematic leaders who are not going to speak what we want collectively as Africans. So now we need to be pushing the conversation in that, right? So and it's important that we highlight the unity today, what the dividends are today, not only that, reminding people of the past, which is great, but also today, what is the importance of Nigeria, of Tanzania, of Egypt, of all African countries coming together today, right? And then what will that, how will that actually help us improve some of the conditions that we find ourselves in? Right. And then, so these are some of the things. So, and then going back to that critique, I was saying in terms of Pan-Africanism, right? Looking at also to challenge some of the various countries, right, that have, for example, illegalized the operation of certain businesses by migrants, fellow African migrants in their own countries. For example, Ghana's Investment Corporation Sector Act of 2013, Zimbabwe's Indigenization and Economic Empowerment Act, which basically prohibits certain migrants or other fellow African migrants from operating in certain sectors within Zimbabwe, right? So the reservation of restricting certain work and businesses to Zimbabweans only. I also want to highlight Botswana's Trade Act 2019, Act of 25 of 2019, and the Industrial Corporation Act 2019, which basically render 70 categories that are ring-fenced only for citizens, right? Tanzania also did the same thing in 2025, which decreed bans to non-citizens from obtaining operational business licenses in 15 localized activities. Some of those activities include, you can't open a hair salon, particularly in the informal sector or the small business sector in Tanzania if you're not Tanzanian. So all of these things that we're seeing African countries doing legally, which, interesting, South Africa is not even taking that approach, right? South Africa is not even taking that approach. So now, and then I think we also then need to bring in that conversation broadly around what does it mean when countries, when we should be, I mean, all of us are talking about unification and, the free access, whether migrant or undocumented, right? So whether documented or undocumented, but the free movement of labor. And we have countries today with legislation that actually prohibits the work of other Africans in certain sectors, which South Africa is not doing. All right. So in that case, I just want to highlight that these are conversations. We should not only link it to South Africa only, but broaden it in terms of the interest of what we need to do as a continent, which is to unify and make free movement possible.
In too many communities, young people are growing up surrounded by noise, but not enough guidance. Surrounded by talent, but not enough opportunity. At Southside Empowerment Jams, we believe music can do more than entertain. It can heal, it can inspire, and it can empower. That's why Beyond the Music and the Young African Leaders Forum, YALF, are creating a powerful space for young people in South Atlanta and East Point. A space where young people are mentored, where creativity meets leadership, where conversations about mental health, financial literacy, civic engagement, technology, and identity become tools for transformation. This is more than an event. It is a movement to remind young people that their voices matter, their stories matter, and their futures matter. Through music, mentorship, and community, Southside Empowerment Jams is building confidence, purpose, and hope, one young life at a time. Because when communities invest in their youth, they invest in a better future for everyone. Southside Empowerment Jams, empowering the next generation beyond the music.
Where do we go from here? So now, as we are finalizing, let's get some final thoughts from, let's start with Africa. Africa, take it away. Your final thoughts on today's conversation. What do you want your listeners to take away?
Yeah, thank you so much, Noah. One thing we also need to get right is that just like other countries, South Africa is a Mickey Mouse economy. It's not very big, just like Africa itself. South Africa's economy is just 460 billion US dollars. And when you take one person, Elon Musk, is now at 1.2 trillion US dollars in terms of valuation. When you look at the whole of Africa, we are at, I think, 3.6 trillion US dollars. And Germany alone, as one country, is now at 5 trillion. Why am I giving these figures? That the challenge with the underdevelopment of Africa should be looked at less of who is taking what job or who is illegally coming to the country, to more of confronting the structural challenges that actually Dr. Dikeleli, sorry for murdering your name, spoke about, and my brother Anere spoke about, the issue of confronting head-on the structural challenges to Africa, not even South Africa, Africa's development. The arrest of our development by the global, by the capture of the global corporations, the fact that we have remained exporters of raw materials, and the fact that even at that, we cannot define and capture the value that comes from our own land, from our own fish, from our own trade, from our own human resources. Once we get that right, that's when Pan-African programs like the African Code of Free Trade Area, the SADC and all that, that's when they, of course, come in place. And lastly, of course, we cannot negate the legitimate reasons, the legitimate, sometimes misinformation, of course, but the legitimate concerns of the young South Africans who really do not bother much, and I don't blame them, on the history of Madiba. I don't have to learn about Madiba when I am really not even aware of how I'm going to earn a living after school. So I feel that the South African government is really not addressing the legitimate concerns that they are having by putting in house its governance failures in order. It has to really tackle that head on. But I am hopeful that one day we are going to really have the Africa that we all aspire to achieve, an Africa that speaks and other countries and continents do listen. I thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well said. Let's go to Kabamanya. Take it away. Your final thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think everything has been said. I can say what we should do as my final thought. One is keep organizing, grassroots organizing, to push the African voice of Ubuntu and unity, but also let's hold our government accountable and responsible, because that's an immediate thing, because we have seen the policy questions and the administration question, the leadership problems. So let's keep holding the government accountable. But generally, and the highest level, let's dismantle the imperialism and neo-colonialism. So that's where we can survive this job. Thank you.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can, Brother Noah.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I want to close where I began. This is a governance failure, but it is also a values failure, and values ultimately are to choices that we have. One of my mentors is a mentor, not directly, he's just someone that I love to follow, is a guy by the name of Ray Dalio. He's the founder of Bridgewater Associates. He's based in Connecticut in the US. He always does a causal analysis in anything that he does. He wants to find the root cause. When we're speaking here about xenophobia, we're speaking at the end of a series of events that have actually happened. What are the series of events? Where did this thing start? It starts in the people seeking greener pastures, seeking a better future for themselves, leaving Nigeria, coming to Pretoria, leaving Lusaka, coming to Durban to seek greener pastures. Why? Because of governance failures in their respective countries. No one leaves their country for worse, for worse situations. You leave because you're looking for better. So the root cause of everything that is happening is governance failures in all our countries, particularly in Africa. So Africa is not short of policies. We have beautiful protocols, visionary frameworks, and eloquent preambles. What we are sometimes short of is the will to enforce them when enforcement is inconvenient. For example, the mayor of Johannesburg will never say, no, it's not an undocumented foreigner who's the reason that you have to stand in a clinic line from 6 a.m. until 12 p.m. It's because I did not supply them with enough money to hire nurses. They will not say that. None of them will, right? So we do not need another statement from the African Union. We do not need another press release expressing deep concern. There's a word that I hate so much right now from the politicians. It's when they say it's unfortunate. It's devoid of all meaning right now. Unfortunate. What does that even mean? Anyway, we do not need another press release. We need governments that actually govern. We need institutions that function. We need leaders that lead. And that's what we don't have right now in Africa. Our own African Union headquarters were not built by our own money. What is that? The Africa we want, the Africa Agendas 2063 of a continental free trade area, of shared prosperity and peace, that Africa will not build itself. It requires us to make it. Decision by decision, policy by policy, statement by statement, and action by action. It requires all of us here in this meeting right now to hold our governments accountable. To say, before you condemn what's currently happening in South Africa, what have you done to stop these people from seeking better pastures in South Africa? You've done nothing. So those are the thoughts that I want to leave you with. Governance failures in all our countries. Let's confront our government and seek solutions and get involved. Thank you.
Well said, well said. Let's go to Prince. Prince, your final thoughts to our listeners, viewers around the world.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I'd like to pick up from where Anili had stopped. It's important that we understand that the challenges themselves, apart from the fact that it's just government failures in countries, it goes beyond government failures. We'll take it back to what Rodney spoke about in how Europe underdeveloped Africa is the exploitation, the way African economies had been through colonization, created to be exploitative. And that has continued to leave room for the kind of failed governance that continue to affect the continent. I think it was Eliud who spoke about the ownership of the means of production on the continent, and we've always had this conversation. But I always say it is a very lengthy process, because for us to talk about the ownership, and I like to be practical in everything that I do, when we talk about the ownership of the means of production, what is the pathway to making that happen on the continent? How long is it going to take us? What are the things that we have in mind? How are we restructuring, like Rodney spoke about, the economy that we inherited, and how are we making that serve the interest of the African people, in itself? In South Africa, for instance, we know that about 20-something% of the lands and stuff in South Africa belong to the black people, and then the other part belong to the whites and other people like that. But we want to be very sure that these things are spectacularly connected to the real causal issues. So through the failures of government and all of that are very, very important causes. Failed economies in African nations are very important causes, but I think, and I always say, that the structural problems and the structural challenges from colonialism have continued to be a major challenge. And for us to go beyond that, we need to really organize ourselves together. To organize ourselves together, xenophobia and Afrophobia is a major impediment. It will never work. South Africa alone cannot liberate its economy. Nigeria alone cannot liberate its economy. And this is what Nkrumah spoke about in his book, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. So no country can liberate its economy because of balkanization. But then in order for us to make this happen, we need to unite as a people. And to unite, Afrophobia, xenophobia, and all of it are major challenges that are impeding this unity. Now, finally, when we talk about Pan-Africanism, I don't look at Pan-Africanism from any other perspective, whether neoliberal or anything. When we talk about Pan-Africanism, for me, I always see it from the lenses of the founding fathers, and that remains the socialist aspect or the socialist pathway to Pan-Africanism. Now, one major challenge, I think it was Mary who was saying something about Pan-African ideals and all of that, and the Agenda 2063 and all of that, people having good speeches and all of that. But I think one of the major challenges of Pan-Africanism today is elitism, the elitism of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is not getting to the grassroots. And this is why I keep hinting that we need to teach our young people. We need to teach them. Teach them is not just talking about, oh, we helped you in the past. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about teach them the need that this guy is your brother. No matter what happens, you cannot take something to hit your brother or attack your brother or something like that. This is your brother. We are currently working and making some projects, with some people, on the continent, and this includes even renowned Africans like Pierre Lumumba and many other people like that. We are trying to see if we can create, a system where Pan-Africanism can be taught across border. But I'm even wondering, does Africa have a system of education from primary school where children are taught Pan-Africanism, where children need to know that, oh, somebody from Zambia, from Malawi, or from wherever is an African just like you are? So the problem is also education. Education is very important. So whether we want to achieve Agenda 2063, whether we want to achieve that economy we are talking about, education is important. If we don't teach the history, if we don't reinforce the need for Pan-Africanism, we cannot, no African country on its own can achieve that on its own. And this is what the former ambassador of African Union to the United States spoke about before she was, fired or something. But we need to understand that you cannot expect South Africa to negotiate with America. and get some renaissance for its own economy. I mean, we have to do this as a people. This is what Nkrumah spoke about. And for us to do that as a people, xenophobia and Afrophobia is affecting us. So no matter what we say, violence against African migrants is never and can never be justified. So we need to know that for us to proceed in that regard, like Cabral would say, we need to get back to the source. We need to return to the source. And that's what I always say. So return to the source, get things right, and ensure that Pan-Africanism is taught. So African schools, from children in kindergartens and preschools and maybe primary schools, need to start learning Pan-Africanism. We need to make that a continental issue so that everybody knows. And I see, before I close, I would like to use Eliud's country, for instance. That is Tanzania. Tanzania is one country on the continent that has managed to overcome the issue of ethnicism, or what we call in colonial sense tribalism. And that is because one man, Julius Nyerere, carefully planted the education of the systems and the orientation. And when I talk about education, I don't mean schools, I mean both formal and informal education, community education and all of that. One man was able to entrench that spirit of Ubuntu on every Tanzanian. So the way we have ethnic issues in Nigeria and other African countries, it doesn't exist in Tanzania. It rarely exists because of the project that was done by Julius Nyerere. So this is something we need to do and make it very spread across the entire African country, or the entire African continent. So Pan-Africanism is important. We need to teach this, and we need to teach history as well. This is very important so that we can understand, so that the next generation can develop that important spirit that we need to free ourselves from neocolonialism, to overcome the neoliberal order, and to become the Africa we actually want by 2063. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Prince. That passionate closing, that's great. Now we're gonna go to the lady to finalize and give us her final thoughts. Take it away.
All right. I would like, by a show of hands, just to show consensus that we actually believe in the same thing. Just raise your hand if you believe that nobody should be discriminated on the basis of their nationality. All right. Please raise your hand or your fist. I love what you've done in Africa, that nobody should be discriminated on the basis of their sexuality, even on our continent. That nobody should be discriminated against on the basis of their religion on our continent. That no one should be discriminated against on the basis of their ethnicity on the continent. That no one should be discriminated against on the basis of any other thing that we use to actually divide people. And I think all of us are in agreement with all of that, right? That no one also should be discriminated on the basis of their gender, etc. And I think what I'm going to do as a closing is just to invoke the words of Gogo Makligi, who was on a particular podcast not too long ago. And he said, we have forgotten who we are as Africans, right? Or as humans for that matter, that we are not our identities, we are not our nationalities, we are none of these things. Spiritually, all of us belong to a specific essence, and that unites all of us. That is whether your religion is whatever, whether your nationality is XYZ, whether your gender is a particular way, or you have a particular sexual orientation, you're a liberal, you're a socialist, whatever. All of us are united by an essence, and it is important for us to remember that. And now when we bring it to the political sphere, I really agree wholeheartedly with what Prince said, right? That Pan-Africanism then becomes our political identity as a continent. That Pan-Africanism also should become the economic identity, a particular socialist approach to Pan-Africanism should become what then we use to decide around our own economic governance model moving forward. So we want the kind of Africa, yes, it will be united, but it's not going to be united whereas certain groups of people, a particular class remains oppressed when the elites also, right? So that's not what we want. And I think we need to be clear. That's why I said earlier, it is important for us to clarify in terms of the permutation or the orientation unification of Pan-Africanism we are advancing. And it's important to do that because not too long ago, we had somebody who's a president in France saying he's a Pan-Africanist. Right? So how the kind of Pan-Africanism should be premised on this idea that all of us are one people. And we must never run away from that. And I would call upon all Africans to rise up in a revolution right now, because that is the moment, at this moment, is the right time to actually wage a revolution that is going to deal with the economic issues, that is going to deal with the political challenges that we have that have led to the lack of unification that we're suffering from. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much.
We are all one people. We belong to the African continent. We look the same. We feel the same. We are the same. And we must always remember who we are. And we should not allow others who have their agenda to cause us to fight amongst ourselves. Let's not lose focus that there are people who want us to divide ourselves. Because when we do that, then there is no unity. When there's no unity, there's no cooperation. When there's no cooperation, we cannot really develop. So we must always remember that we are the same people. And once again, I thank you all. Be proud of who you are and what you represent. So thank you all. Bye for now.
Thank you all. Asante sana.